Is Western civilization today showing the same patterns of collapse that once brought down Rome? And what can we here in Israel after October 7th learn from 200 years of stubborn Jewish resistance against the most powerful empire on earth? So welcome everyone, I am Matan Hasidim, and this is my podcast on contemporary culture and Jewish thought for the 21st century. Today I have the immense privilege of hosting one of the world's distinguished military historians, Professor בארי Shtrouss. And just to give you a quick sense of his really remarkable career, Professor Shtrouss taught history for over 40 years at Cornell University and is currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. He has written 17 books on the ancient world, translated into 19 languages. He's covered the Trojan War, the Battle of Salamis, Spartacus, Julius Caesar, and his brilliant book, 10 Caesars, which have been translated into Hebrew and, in my opinion, serves as an excellent introduction to understanding the history of the Roman Empire as a whole. So today we're diving into his fascinating new book, recently translated into Hebrew again, which connects our history directly to ancient Rome. In English, it's Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. I'm just going to show it now in Hebrew. It's called יהודה נגד רומא, 200 שנות מרד נגד האימפריה החזקה בעולם, בהוצאת שיבולת. So, Professor Shtrouss, welcome to the show. It's really an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for hosting me.
So let's dive in, and I love to divide our conversation today into 2 parts. So we'll start by talking about the book, the history of the Jewish rebellions you describe, and the critical lessons we in Israel must draw from them, especially in the aftermath of October 7th. From there, I'd like us to move to the bigger picture, maybe the state of Western civilization today and the striking parallels that you, as a profound and serious scholar, drew between our current reality in the West and the collapse of Rome. So let's start from the beginning. Throughout your career, you have mostly written about Greece and Rome, and now you have dedicated a book to a critical chapter in Jewish history. I understand that you began working on this back in 2020, so it wasn't sparked by recent events, October 7th, and etc. What made you want to dedicate an entire book to the Jewish rebellions against Rome?
Well, I've long been fascinated by Josephus and the subject, and there's a lot of excellent research on the subject. But as I looked at it, I thought there was an important aspect of it that had not been adequately covered. And that is what we might call the Parthian connection, or if you prefer, the Iranian connection. And that was the window that I tried to open in this book in particular, that I thought made it somewhat different than other books on the subject.
Yeah, so I just wrote to me before that one of the most special aspects of your book is the Jewish reliance on the Parthian Empire, essentially ancient Iran, as you said, as a geopolitical counterweight to Rome. If you can just elaborate, tell us a little bit about this Parthian connection.
Sure. Well, there are many different angles to it. First of all, as you know, for centuries, there had been a warm relationship between the Jewish people and the Persian empires. First, the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, and Cyrus famously liberated the Jews from Babylonian captivity. But the Jewish community continued in Parthian lands, particularly in Mesopotamia, what modern Iraq, and it prospered there under Iranian rule, first under Achaemenid rule, and then later on under Parthian rule, so a different dynasty, but both Iranian. And Judea itself had been an Iranian colony for 2 centuries, and it had done pretty well. I mean, the Iranians governed it with a very relatively light hand. We might also say that the Zoroastrian religion, though not strictly speaking monotheistic, it was closer in spirit to Judaism than the paganism, the polytheistic religion of Greece and Rome.
Right.
So,
Something about the moralistic view of the world, right?
yes. So, there was a supreme deity, Ahura Mazda, and a sense religion was very moralistic. As you say, the idea that the world was divided between good and evil and a struggle between good and evil. I think it's ironic that the Hebrew word for religion comes from Persian, dat.
Right. That.
So, yeah.
Yes,
So
it's first in the Book of Esther. Yeah.
I believe so, yeah. So there are close connections, really, between the two. And one of the things I've learned in my research is that, on the whole, over the millennia, Jewish-Iranian relations have been relatively good. Sometimes have been very good. There have been some bumps in the road, and there have been some pogroms and nastiness. But compared to Western Europe, it looks pretty good, I have to say, all things considered, which is something to think about in terms of the present. But yeah, in terms of getting back to the ancient world, so there is this connection. And when Judea was conquered by various other peoples, by Alexander the Great and the Greco-Macedonians, then by the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, they struggled back and forth over it. There were those in Judea who looked fondly, nostalgically, to rule by the Iranians, and who thought this was really a better way for us. And under the Roman rule, I think this became even stronger. So, of course, in the 2nd century BCE, the Jews won their freedom under the Maccabees and the Hasmonean dynasty. And for the first time in centuries, Judea became an independent state again. That was a monumental event, which had a great deal to do with the adoption of the Torah, or what one might say with the expansion of the Torah in Judea. And also, it was very disappointing to the Jews when, about a century after liberation, they came under the thumb of Rome, under the thumb of Pompey, who conquered Judea in the year 63 BCE. There were two factions in Judea, at least two factions, one more pro-Roman and one more pro-Parthian. And about 25 years later, in the year 40, the pro-Parthian faction prevailed. The Parthians invaded Judea, and they put their own king on the throne. They kicked out the ruler who had been pro-Roman. And for the next 3 years, there was a war. There was a struggle going on until finally the Romans prevailed. In the year 37, Judea was firmly back under the thumb of Rome, and it was ruled by a pro-Roman ruler, by Herod, the famous and infamous King Herod.
Yes, we're going to speak about Herod quite a lot. So,
Yeah.
but just to set the stage for audience, if you were to give us like a bird's eye view about the geopolitical, cultural landscape look like back then, and what is the overarching story of the three major rebellions that define this period? Even as an Israeli, when I was in Mitzada and learned about a lot about this period, always I get mixed between the different rebellions and different stages, Bar-Kוכbא and the big revolt. So if you just can,
Sure. So there are a number of rebellions, but there are three major ones. The first one is the Great Revolt. That's the one that ends up at Masada. That's a revolt between the years 66 and 70 with Masada or Matsadak, probably in the year 74 taking place. Then the least well-known revolt, the Diaspora Revolt, which was centered in the diaspora in the former Ptolemaic lands, so in Egypt, in Libya, and in Cyprus. It took place while the Romans were invading the Parthian Empire. They conquered Armenia, a Parthian vassal state, we might say, or a allied state, and then they conquered all of Mesopotamia. And then they're faced with an uprising. And the Jewish population of Mesopotamia played a very leading role in this uprising in driving out the Romans. They had many good reasons to be pro-Parthian and anti-Roman at the time. Of course, the Romans by then had destroyed the temple. They had ravaged Judea, and they had imposed a tax on every Jew in the Roman Empire. The infamous Fiscus Judaicus, totally unprecedented. The Romans had never done anything like that before. And so naturally, the Jews of Parthia did not want to pay this tax either, or be humiliated by the Romans. So this took place in the year 116, 117. Very serious rebellion, since Rome was engaged in war abroad. They had to divert a legion to Egypt to put the rebellion down. Unfortunately for the rebels, the Romans succeeded in brutally suppressing the rebellion and in massacring a very large part of the Jewish population of those areas, turning Alexandria from a great Jewish city, possibly the most populous Jewish city in the world, to a city with almost no Jews living in it. So it was devastating. And then came the final revolt, the Bar-Kוכbא revolt, from 132 to 136. This brings us back to Judea, and led, of course, by the famous Bar-Kוכbא. In some ways, this is the most challenging revolt for the Romans. It was a guerrilla uprising that availed itself of irregular warfare techniques, very difficult for the Romans to put down. They had to bring in their best commander from Britain at the other end of the empire, and it took them several years before they finally did, alas, succeed, and driving out most of the Jewish population from Yehuda, forcing, there were still some pockets of Jewish settlement in that area, but forcing most of the surviving Jews who wanted to stay in the Holy Land to move to the Galilee, which became the center of Jewish life in Eretz Yisrael for the next several centuries.
Okay, great. So we're going to speak a lot about them in details, but just another general question that is very, very important, I think. There were many different types of rebellions across the Roman Empire, right? What made the Jewish resistance so exceptionally fierce and unique in the eyes of Rome, or maybe even generally, historically speaking?
Well, for one thing, most rebellions in the Roman Empire took place within a generation or so of the conquest of their territory. The Jewish revolt was different because it took place well over a century after the Romans first conquered Judea, first entered Judea. So the Romans looked at it as a betrayal in a way that they didn't look at the other revolts. But secondly, and I think more important, was the fact that the Jewish revolt was connected to Rome's greatest enemy, Parthia. Parthia is not just any old country. It is the number one enemy of the Romans. It was to the Romans what the USSR was to the Americans in the Cold War, or what China might be today, the number one enemy. And the rebels in Judea openly tried to get help from the Parthians. There was no question about it. And the Romans saw this as a threat. Also, Judea was located near the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. And the Romans were always worried about the Parthians coming back. The Parthians had conquered Syria in the first century BCE. The Parthians had threatened Roman rule of the Near East. The Romans were well aware of this, well aware of the fact that the Iranian Empire at its height had included Egypt, had gone much further west than it was under the Parthians. And so the Romans saw the revolt in Judea as a multiple challenge. It wasn't just a revolt by a provincial people. It was a revolt by a provincial people who had been loyal in Roman eyes for a long time. And it was a revolt that opened the door to Parthian intervention and possibly to a nightmare in the Eastern Roman Empire. So
broadly,
I mean, that's one from the Roman point of view. That's why these revolts, starting with the Great Revolt, was so serious. Also, we need to point out the fact that the Jews were widespread in the Roman Empire. Jews weren't only limited to Judea. There were Jews who lived especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, in all the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Large Jewish population. There's a Jewish population in Rome. Jews were starting to come into the Western Empire. And the Jewish religion was popular with Romans. There were many Romans who they did not, scholars will debate what conversion meant in this period of history. But there are many Romans who did not consider themselves Jewish, but who nonetheless would go to, say, Shabbat in a synagogue, They would hang around synagogues because there are many things about the Jewish way of life that appeal to them.
Right. I think that we can read in the Talmud very interesting stuff about people from the elites, actually, in Roman society that are close to Judaism or keeping Shabbat or really fully integrated in Jewish life.
Yeah. Yeah. Even in the 4th century CE, when the Roman Empire was almost fully Christianized, we have Christian voices saying, Christians, stop going to synagogue. You know, you really have to separate yourself from what goes on in synagogues. We're different. So again, it really had quite an appeal to many people.
Okay, great. Now, broadly speaking, did any other nations or provinces under Roman rule actually manage to launch a successful rebellion against the empire?
Yes. So the first example would be Scotland. So the Romans never succeeded in maintaining control of Scotland, and they pretty much had to give up on it. They weren't able to keep it. Second example would be Germany. So the German tribes united under a man named Arminius, sometimes translated into German as Hermann or Hermann. So in the year 9, at the Battle of Teutoburger Woods, he ambushed a Roman commander and destroyed 3 legions, about 15,000 men. Devastating defeat for the Romans, and the Romans were forced to withdraw west of the Rhine, except for a short period in southern Germany when they did go across the Rhine. For the rest of Roman history, they never went across the Rhine again. They had already marked out new cities in central Germany. They'd gone as far east as the Elbe River in Germany, and they were forced to give all those up because of that defeat. So that was a tremendous victory. The Romans had tried to conquer Nubia, which is roughly Sudan, and they were driven out. They failed to do that. That never became a Roman colony, a Roman province, but the Romans were driven out of there. In the British Museum, there is a wonderful bust of the Emperor Augustus with bronze and I forget what material the eyes are of, but it's very, very striking. What's really interesting about it, it was found buried under the threshold of a temple in Sudan. Everyone who entered this temple was treading on the head of the Roman emperor. It was a way for the Nubians to sate their victory over the Romans. And of course, the Roman attempt to conquer Mesopotamia failed. I mean, the Roman Emperor Trajan got as far as the Persian Gulf. And he was given the name Parthicus because he had conquered the Parthians. But his conquest lasted for a year, and the rebellion managed to drive him out. So I would say, on the whole, most rebellions against Rome failed, without question. But there were some examples of success.
Yes, that's going to be very important for us when you're going to speak about the Jewish resilience and if it was rational or it was irrational and how much was it. But just if you can tell us a little bit about what has led to the first big revolt of the Jews in your perspective.
Okay, so a couple of different factors. It's a great question, and unfortunately, Josephus, who's very valuable in many ways, kind of punts on the answer to that, and so it makes it difficult. But I guess a couple of factors. First of all, there was always a minority in Judea who, from the word go, opposed the Romans. For example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find very anti-Roman references very early on. And so there were always those against the Jews, among the Jews who rebelled. There was a family that rebelled against the Romans and that crossed the border into Syria and attacked Roman villages very early on in the 1st century BCE, not long after the establishment of Roman rule. So there is this small minority, and they rebel after Herod's death in the year 4 BCE. They rebel again when Rome declared Judea a Roman province in the year 6 CE. And there are other smaller uprisings, let us say, in the intervening years. But why the big revolt in the year 66? Well, I think a couple of reasons. One is that the Romans started squeezing the people of Judea more than they had before. The emperor, who was Nero, wanted money to rebuild the city of Rome after the Great Fire.
Quite a figure, Nero.
Quite a figure, Nero, yes. And people often forget that he was the emperor at the start of the Great Revolt. His governors were stealing money from the Jews right and left. There was ethnic conflict in Judea, so there's significant non-Jewish groups living in Judea. The most significant, I would say, were the Greek-speaking Syrians. Many of these were Syrians who had adopted Greek after the years of conquest, centuries of conquest by Greek-speaking empires. They lived in cities like Caesarea or Hippos in the Galilee, and they were very anti-Jewish. There are a series of riots there in the year 66 in which the Romans sided with the Greeks. The Roman governor stole money from the temple. The temple was very wealthy, and it was very tempting for the Romans to take money from it. He also engages in a massacre of civilians in Jerusalem, all of which encourages the rebel forces. Now, there are different groups among the rebels. There's this, I mentioned, there's a family from the north, from the Galilee or the Golan, who had long been opposed to the Romans. But among the elite, the establishment in Jerusalem, among the priesthood, which had typically collaborated closely with the Romans, young people rise to the fore who differ from their fathers, and they want to revolt against the Romans. Josephus calls them zealots, zelote in Greek, which presumably comes from the Canaan. And these are people who, in some sense, see themselves as continuing the mission of Pinchas and Elijah, defending the honor of God. So they have religious reasons, but they're not completely irrational. The other thing that's going on is Parthia is still there, and there's still connections to Parthia. And one of the most interesting ones is the dynasty of a kingdom called Adiabene. It's essentially equivalent to modern-day Iraqi Kurdistan. It had been Assyria. Perhaps it had been where the 10 tribes had ended up. But for whatever reason, the ruling dynasty of this place, maybe in the 30s CE, convert to Judaism. And the dowager queen, a woman named Queen Helena, actually moves to Jerusalem. And she spends a number of years in Jerusalem and in Judea, learning about Judaism and being a philanthropist. For instance, she helped when there was a famine in Judea, and she arranged for food to come to Judea. And she and her son, as she's buried in Jerusalem, she's buried in what is now the Tomb of the Kings in East Jerusalem. And her sons were buried there as well. And her grandsons and other members of the royal family built palaces in Jerusalem. And they went to Jerusalem in a way that the Herodian dynasty sent its sons and grandsons to Rome to be educated. This dynasty from Iraqi Kurdistan sent its family to Jerusalem to be educated as Jews. And when the revolt broke out in the year 66, they joined it. They fought on behalf of the rebels, and some of them are still there in 70 when Titus takes the city and they're forced to surrender to the Romans. Now we have to piece together parts of the puzzle that are missing. It's part of a mystery. Did they tell the rebels, gee, we can bring you support from Parthia?
From Parthia, right.
Yes, because they are vassal kings of Parthia. Parthian Empire has a series of vassal or client kingdoms within it, and Adiabene is one of them. We don't know what was passed back and forth. We know that the rebels tried to get help from Parthia. We know that they got very little. The only help we know they got of is this handful of people from Adiabene. But if there are members of the royal family of Adiabene living in Jerusalem and joining the revolt, we can be sure that these people had servants, and we can be sure that they had followers. So we can be sure there are more than, let us say, 6 people from Adiabene joining the revolt. I wouldn't be surprised if there were several hundred. We don't know. Certainly not a significant number, not significant enough to win the war for the rebels.
So here's a big question: why haven't the Parthian Jews have gone more for the aid for the Jews in Judea and helped the rebels?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know the answer, but I can think of reasons. One reason might be that the Parthian king told them not to do it. And so why would the Parthians not do this? After all, it's to their advantage to have...
Right, it's the big rivals of Rome, yeah.
Because they had other fish to fry. For one thing, they had defeated the Roman army on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, what is now central/eastern Turkey. We're not sure of exactly the location. In the year 63, and they had forced the Romans to acknowledge that a member of the Parthian royal dynasty would from thenceforth be king of Armenia. Armenia in ancient times and in medieval times was a much bigger country than it is today. It included a lot of what is now eastern Turkey. So it's a pretty significant place. And the Romans are forced to accept a Parthian ruler of Armenia. It's true that this Parthian ruler has to go to Rome to do obeisance to the Roman emperor, but he does it in such a way that it's kind of very much in your face to the Romans. So the Romans don't have a clear victory there. So the Romans don't want to the Parthians don't want to rock the boat with the Romans. That's one thing. A second thing is that the Parthians are faced by marauding tribes on their eastern frontier at this very time. So I think they have their reasons to not join the revolt. Did they pressure Parthian Jews not to join the revolt? I don't know. Perhaps. And it's troubling that more Parthian Jews didn't join the revolt, without any question.
Yes, they had their problems, indeed. So just to finish this opening of just viewing the big picture, maybe I should have asked it earlier, but when we talked about Jewish exceptionalism by this revolt, it's not just by the eyes of the Romans, right? It's generally speaking, it's like 200 years of this, as I said in the opening, stubbornness of the Jews is something very, very not common, right?
Right. So it's not common. And I should say, just a footnote, in ways it's less than 200 years, and in ways it's more than 200 years. So it's not as if for all 200 years the Jews are rebelling every single year. Right. Of course, that's not what's happening. And for a lot of the period, probably most of the period, there's no rebellion going on. It's just that there's this undercurrent of rebellion that comes back again and again. And by the way, there are other revolts. There's one in the 4th century, the so-called Gallus revolt. It's very shadowy, but it takes place in the Galilee. There seems to be a Messiah figure. And then, even after that, in the 7th century CE, in 614, when a latter-day Iranian Empire, the Sasanian Empire, invades what is by then called Roman Palestine, the Jews join them. They're Jews who join this revolt that help the Iranians, and the Iranians reward them by allowing them to rule Jerusalem again for a very short period. So the Jews never give up their desire to rebel against Rome. Or I should say, some Jews never give up, because there are others who just collaborate and say, well, that's life. You have to just move on. But yes, it is exceptional. There are other people who rebel. There are 2 great rebellions in what is now sort of Croatia and Serbia, for example, mostly Croatia. There's a big rebellion in Britain under the famous Queen Boudica. There are rebellions in Gaul. There is a insurgency in what is now Algeria in the 1st century. Earlier on, during the Republic, there had been rebellions in Greece. There were rebellions in Italy against the Romans. Everywhere you go, there were rebellions against the Romans. But the Jewish one is particularly persistent, and I think that's a tribute to the power of Jewish nationalism. And I'd also say that in this period, there is a fine line between what we would now call nationalism, what we'd now call religion.
Right.
I mean, they're all tied together. They're one in this period, and I think the existence of the Torah is just really crucial to what's going on. The fact that the Jews have a holy book and they have a guide to what they're doing. We also know that the synagogues as an institution had spread by this period.
Right.
So even with the loss of the temple, there are local foci, there are local loci of rebellion and of resistance. And the Jews have a sense that they are a people. They can't be destroyed as a people by the destruction of Jerusalem or even by the destruction of the temple.
Right. So this is maybe another big mystery, and we're going to talk about it maybe again later from a different angle.
Right.
But, I talked with Professor Stephen Grosby, who is an expert on nationalism in history and everything.
Right.
And he said to me, a lot of different tribes, a lot of different nations, not just the Jews, were a nation, and they had their own, God of the nation, God of the land and everything.
Right.
So again, when you say that Jews has a very efficient nationalistic way of looking at the world, and
Right.
I think it was quite common in this time in history, no?
No. I mean, what made the Jews different? Certainly, there are other peoples who thought of themselves as nations, of course, but the Jews have an infrastructure to inculcate this and to make sure that it's not forgotten. There's only one other people whose religion the Romans are upset about, make war on, and that's the Druids in Britain. Because the Druids are also nationalists. They are an institution that is keeping the spirit of resistance alive in Britain, and the Romans find this very threatening. The Romans are not troubled by the Greek gods. Of course, they worship their own form of the Greek gods. They're not troubled by the Egyptian gods. I don't really mind that. It's the Jewish God that bothers them, and doesn't even bother them so much. The Romans try to wipe Judaism out. They don't make war on all the Jews of the Roman Empire. They just want to make sure that they can't rebel anymore. They want to take away the spirituality behind the rebellion. I mean, I think that's one of the big differences, that there is a spiritual belief in the Jewish people and in resistance that you don't necessarily find elsewhere.
Is it the belief of the chosen people is a very fundamental belief in Judaism?
Yes, certainly, but also that there's an infrastructure to spread it.
Infrastructure, yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think that's really very important. Having the holy book, and then having first the Pharisees and then the rabbis is a very important part of what's going on.
Okay, so we often dwell on the mistakes made by the Jewish rebels, and we're going to do it, don't worry. But what about the Romans? Like, what tactical or strategic blunders did Rome commit during these wars?
Well, yeah, first of all, the Romans again and again behave arrogantly and inconsiderately of local populations, and they're always surprised when rebellions break out. But as one of my colleagues put it, the Romans came to realize that rebellion is just a part of the price of doing business. He compared it to automobile accidents. It's the price of living in a mobile society. And the Romans shrugged their shoulders and said, well, rebellions happen. But the Romans certainly did not have to incite this rebellion among the Jews. They didn't have to side so fully with the Greeks, and they didn't have to loot the temple. They didn't have to massacre civilians in Jerusalem. Once they did, they needed to take the revolt more seriously and have a more thorough means of repressing it. There had been a rebellion in the year 4 BCE after Herod's death, and the Roman governor of Syria then was extremely efficient, marched into Judea rapidly, and he put down the rebellion quite handily before it could turn into something bigger. In this case, the governor of Syria was kind of slow into marching into Judea, and he made a half-hearted attempt to take Jerusalem by siege, but he wasn't very serious about it. It was the wrong time of year. It was October, not the time you want to start a siege, being in the rainy season. And then he gets ambushed. His army is ambushed in the Beit Horon Pass, going westward, and the rebels destroy almost an entire legion. This is a real humiliation for the Romans and a threat to the Romans. This is bad for business, for other people to see that a Roman legion can be crushed like this. And that inspires Nero to send in a much better general and more forces to put the rebellion down. But if I could just return for one moment to the excellent question you asked before about why the Jewish rebels were so determined. There's an incident in Josephus that takes place about 25 years before the Great Revolt, when the Emperor Caligula Gaius wants to put a statue of the emperor in the temple. This is to punish the Jews because they had overturned an altar where the pagans were sacrificing to the emperor in the land of Israel. And the governor of Syria, the most important Roman official close to Judea, is confronted by the fact that large numbers of Jews give him the message, we are willing to fight and die to stop this from happening. You will have a very serious rebellion on your hands if you do this. I think that kind of belief, call it fanaticism if you will, but this very strong belief is something that gave the Romans pause, and it's one of the reasons the rebels were so successful. This governor, by the way, realized that if we continue with this plan to put a statue of the emperor in the temple, we will have a very major revolt on our hands, and he refuses to do it. The emperor wants him to be executed as punishment, but he's assassinated before it can be carried out. So the emperor's assassinated, that is. So the punishment doesn't happen. But I think this is a sign of the degree of seriousness of many among the Jewish people about what they were prepared to accept and what they weren't prepared to accept in their land.
So, in this point, I just wanted to ask you, I could remember it as it was yesterday when I was in high school. And we got a teacher, I think it was a professor from university, that came to our school and talked to us about, we Jews, we think that we are so special, and maybe it's a little bit arrogant. And we think of the Jewish rebellion as something that was really hard for the Romans. But really, it wasn't so. Like, the Romans really hadn't need to, like, a real sweat. It wasn't so hard for the Romans. They haven't took it as we think it was for them. So how much it was really hard for the Romans, this rebellion in Judea?
Yeah, great question. So I disagree with the professor. So for one thing, the Romans had to put together an army of 60,000 troops to put the rebellion down, which is a significant number for them. For another thing, it's certainly true that they didn't have a lot of trouble conquering the north, conquering the Galilee and the Golan and other parts of Judea. But they did have a lot of trouble conquering Jerusalem. And it was an extremely well-fortified city. The rebels put up a huge fight. And we know that a lot of Romans died in the siege. We don't know how many. Josephus does not tell us how many Romans died in the siege, which tells you something already, that he doesn't tell us how many died. But the only way that Titus was able to take the city was that he had to be willing to sacrifice a lot of men. So it was a strain on the Romans. I think the Bar-Kוכbא revolt was even a bigger strain on the Romans. We know that the Emperor Hadrian did not engage in his usual custom. The usual custom of the Roman emperors was that when they went to the Senate to address the Senate, they would say, "The army and I are well. I hope it is well with you as well." he didn't say it. He couldn't say it because the army wasn't well. So this was very striking to people at the time. So it took a lot of effort for the Romans to put down that rebellion. Likewise, the diaspora revolt, the Romans had to withdraw a legion from the conquest of the Parthian Empire and send it westward to put down the rebels in Egypt and Libya and Cyprus. They also had to put down what could have turned into a rebellion in Judea as well. Apparently it didn't. And I think the Romans were always resentful of what the Jews had done. I think that one of the reasons why Hadrian decided to turn the ruins of Jerusalem into a pagan city was to make a point, to discourage any future Jewish rebellion, and to tell the Parthians the Romans may have lost in Parthia, as they did, but we're still on the eastern frontier, and we're not giving up Judea. In fact, we're strengthening our presence there. It's possible also that he abolished circumcision, that he made circumcision illegal. We know that he did. The question is whether he did it before the revolt, the Bar-Kokhba revolt, or as punishment for the Bar-Kokhba revolt. And there's some good scholars who argue that he did it before the Bar-Kokhba revolt. So I think the Romans were very disturbed about Jewish rebellion.
Taking it seriously, yeah.
They took it very seriously. They paid a big price for it.
Okay, so just a quick note about Josephus as a historical source.
Right.
So, Josephus Flavius is a deeply complicated, I think, a Jewish commander who defected to Rome. When we rely on him as a central source for core narrative like Masada or the mass suicide, how do you as a modern historian separate imperial propaganda and his desire to please his Roman masters from historical truth?
Yeah, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. I mean, Josephus is, as you say, is a very complicated figure. He is a rebel commander who defects to the Romans, but he also considers himself a very believing Jew. He comes from a priestly family, from the Jerusalem elite, and he says in his book that the reason he went to the Romans is that he got a message from Hashem that this is what he should do, that this is what would be the best thing for the Jewish people. And we might say, oh, he's just being cynical. He doesn't believe this. But maybe he did believe it. We really don't know that he didn't believe it. Likewise, his remarkable survival when these 40 or so men who survived the Roman conquest of Jotapata were in a suicide pact that he was totally opposed to. And it comes down to only 2 men left, Josephus and another man. They've all killed each other. And Josephus says, come on, let's surrender to the Romans. And the guy says, sure. So cynics say that this is what mathematicians now call the Josephus problem, that there's a way to stack the deck so that you'd be the last 2 surviving. But it's also possible that he wasn't planning to do this, and he saw this as miraculous. He saw this as divine intervention to make him survive. I think in any case, Josephus in his books is trying to do 2 things. One, he's trying to give a message to his fellow Jews: don't rebel against the Romans again. It's a terrible idea because, as a matter of fact, the Romans are barbarians. They're brutes. They're savage. You cannot defeat them. But the other thing he's trying to do is he's trying to justify the Jewish people in the eyes of the Romans. And he's trying to say to the Romans, first of all, the Jews are pretty serious fighters. Secondly, they are a noble people. They are an ancient people who are inspired by a pure and admirable belief in God. And they have much to contribute to the world, and we should respect them. And by the way, he also says, most Jews remain loyal to Rome. It was only a few bad apples who caused the revolt. Now that we've gotten rid of them, everything is okay. I think he's kind of exaggerating the opposition to the revolt in that last part. But so getting back to your question, can you trust Josephus? The answer is no. You can't trust Josephus. You certainly can't trust him on some of the numbers. Some of the numbers of casualty figures may be correct. And some of the numbers of the number of Jews who were sold into slavery after the rebellion was suppressed may be correct. Some of the other numbers are preposterous and they can't possibly be correct. But he's not the only historian of the ancient world to engage in competitive exaggeration. I think as scholars, what we need to do is to bring all of our knowledge of the Greco-Roman and Jewish worlds to bear, and to try to say, what do we know is plausible and what do we think is implausible? And what are Josephus's motives in telling the story? We do have a few other sources of information. We have a lot of archaeological sources of information, and we do have some papyri, most famously the papyri that survived from the Bar-Kוכbא revolt. We do have some papyri that survived from the Great Revolt as well. Probably more important is the coins of the Great Revolt. I mean, they're really valuable documents, and they tell us a great deal. We do have some pagan Roman sources. Unfortunately, the main one, a historian named Tacitus, he wrote a book about this period in Roman history, and the chapter on the Jewish revolt, which was an extensive chapter, only the beginning parts of it survives. We don't have most of it, which is too bad because it would have given us a different perspective. So yes, Josephus has to be handled very carefully and very cautiously and very skeptically. But once you do that, there is a lot that you can get out of it.
Yes, and one of the most interesting comments I think you had in one of your podcasts about the subject, that you described the speeches Josephus wrote in Greek about the Metzodah as some of the most powerful defenses of the concept of liberty in antiquity, right?
Yes.
Exaggerating, yes.
No, you're not exaggerating. I mean, I think it's one of the most moving, the first speech by Eliezer, I think is one of the most moving defenses of liberty in ancient Greek literature, which I find amazing. You know, you would think surely you'd find that in one of the speeches from democratic Athens, but I think in some ways this speech is more powerful.
Okay, so now let's get into maybe the most difficult issue regarding Israel politics even today.
Right.
Tough question that carries a lot of weight for us in Israel, because Messianism is not really something that just in history, but it's in current Israeli society and, of course, politics today.
Right.
So maybe the first question is, were these Jewish rebellions fated to fail from the very beginning, in your eyes?
I think it was a long shot, but I don't think they were fated to fail. I mean, I think that, well, first of all, if they could have gotten Parthian help, that would have changed the game. That would have been
as we talked about, yeah.
Right. But without Parthian help, it would have been tough. But one of the mysteries about the first revolt is why the rebels didn't engage in guerrilla tactics. Why they didn't engage in irregular tactics against the Romans. Why instead they chose to stay behind the walls of their fortified cities, knowing that the Romans were very good at taking fortified cities and not very good in dealing with guerrilla tactics. That is one of the mysteries. Could they have succeeded? Probably not, but maybe they could have reached a modus vivendi with the Romans. This is what one of my colleagues, the great Martin Goodman, suggests, that they might have been able to reach a modus vivendi with the Romans, in which the rebels would keep Jerusalem and the Romans would have the coast. After all, the Romans only wanted Jerusalem to the degree that it was important to be there to keep the Jews down. The Romans governed Judea from Caesarea. That was the Roman capital. Jerusalem was not as important for them. It's possible that that could have succeeded. I doubt that it would have lasted in the long run, because the Romans were the kind of people who never forgot anything, and eventually they probably would have come back. So I guess unlikely that the revolts could have succeeded. As a historian, I am really opposed to historical inevitability as a concept. And so when we look at the revolts and say, there's no way, it had to end up the way that it did. No one ever successfully revolted against the Romans. Actually, some people did successfully revolt against the Romans. They're in the minority. Most of the revolts failed, but I can imagine a scenario in which the revolt succeeded. Also, let's not forget that there was a civil war going on in Rome in the middle of all of this. You know, Nero is forced out of office, forced to commit suicide in the year 68, and the suppression of the rebellion by Vespasian was put on hold because he didn't know what was going to happen. He had no idea of what was going to happen in Rome, and we can imagine a scenario in which the Romans are distracted with the civil war, and they're not really all that engaged in what's going on in the eastern part of the empire. They need to look westward. It's the Jews' bad luck that Vespasian becomes the Roman emperor. And he's the one guy who could not afford to go easy on Judea. He's kind of an illegitimate emperor in the eyes of the Romans because he is not a member of the Roman aristocracy. He comes from what the Roman nobles were very snobbish. Roman society was very snobbish. They might have looked at him as kind of a middle-class slob, and he needed some street cred. And his street cred was the conquest of Judea. In the first coins that he issues after the taking of suppression of the world, he says Judea has been reconquered, and he drops that and immediately switches it to Judea has been conquered. What's the difference? Reconquering a rebellious province is not a major success from the Roman point of view. It's okay. It's what an also-ran does. Conquering a new province, that's what a great Roman does. So Vespasian and Titus have to pretend that Judea was a new province. It wasn't. It was a rebellious province. And they rebuild the landscape of Rome in order to broadcast their success. The most famous example is the Colosseum. The Colosseum is a victory monument to success over Judea. And it's crowned by Vespasian in a chariot as the victor of Judea. And there's an inscription put up saying that the Colosseum is paid for by loot from the war. It doesn't say which war, but scholars believe it's referring to the Jewish war. And there are other things in Rome, other buildings in Rome also that reflect this. So, but if Vespasian hadn't become emperor, yeah, I can see that the rebels might have been able to carve out an agreement with Rome that they get to keep part of the area and the Romans are out of it. Could they have kept it in the long term? Probably only if they'd gotten Parthian help, but maybe they would have gotten Parthian help. It could have gone differently. It could have gone differently.
So in a couple of moments, I would like us to really enter about and describing how it could have been otherwise. But first, I think that if we're going to want to get into the topic of Messianism and realpolitik, we need maybe to speak about the era of the rebellions in Judea was defined by intense messianic energy, I think.
It was.
Why was this apocalyptic thinking was so central to the zeitgeist of this period?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer it because I'm a military historian. But I suspect it's partly because there are, what shall I call it, fringe groups, breakaway groups in Judea who are unsatisfied with the priesthood and the way that priests are running the temple. Most famously, the Essenes. They probably were the Essenes, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they are looking for a way out. They're looking for a way other than the established way. So it would make sense, I think, that they would call for the Messiah to come. They would call for some force from outside the stage to come. This is very crude on my part. I apologize for that. I guess I would say, it's a really good question why apocalypticism comes now. It's the sort of thing that historians don't have an easy time answering. I think also the arrival of the Romans on the scene, and it seems to be ushering in a new period of history, and in some ways a terrible period of history. The empires that had ruled this area for centuries are now swept away, and you have a new one, a particularly militarily impressive empire, one that's capable of great brutality, but that's also capable of collaborating with local people. The Romans are always good at that. I think that's also one of the reasons why people are thinking in apocalyptic terms. Who are these new people? What is this new empire?
Yes, and we know that messianic view, especially a biblical one, before it's going to get very good, it first needs to be very bad,
Yes.
And of course, I'm saying it really, really shallow way. We can
Right.
even think about it in Hegelian terms,
Yes.
the
Yes.
thesis and the antithesis, and
Right.
then
Right. Right.
history must
Right.
go
Right.
on, like in
Right.
that way. Yes.
Yes.
And this period is the period of the rising of Christianity. And maybe
Yes.
it's a good way for us to ask, what can we learn about the fundamental differences between Judaism and Christianity, differences that were forged during that very era of Christians' formation?
Yeah, it is. It is amazing, and I think my book has had a certain amount of appeal among to many Christians because it's opening up a period of early Christian history from a different perspective, of course. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think Christianity, in some sense, clearly, it's another messianic movement. It's another apocalyptic movement. I mean, Jesus says the temple is going to be swept away and a new temple is going to be built. Um, and his followers say that he is the Messiah. Um, so they're coming from that milieu. They're coming from a milieu which is very familiar in the Jewish world. Um, but it's also a movement that is looking out from the Jewish world. I mean, part of Jesus' message seems to be that you don't need the temple to be Jewish because I can forgive sins. You really don't need to make sacrifices at the temple. And although his gospel is not specifically aimed at non-Jews, it's not aimed at non-Jews at all. His followers, in particular Paul, do say this is a message that we want to bring to non-Jews, a message that we want to bring to the Gentiles.
For all the Gentiles, yes.
For all the Gentiles. So it's going in a different from the same apocalyptic and messianic route, perhaps also influenced from very early on by Greek thought. I mean, after all, Jesus comes from Galilee, and there are Greek cities so close for him growing up in Nazareth, remarkably close. There are some scholars who have suggested that he was influenced by Greek philosophy. I don't know that we can ever know that.
Yes,
but
I can recall the very interesting note of a very big scholar in the New Testament, James Barr. And he
Yes.
writes about how the New Testament is a Greek way of thinking with Jewish, Jewish names, the Jewish God, the Jewish terms from the Old Testament. But essentially, it's like a more Greek way of thinking about theology.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think it's important to remember that by this period, by the time of Jesus, the Torah had been translated into Greek.
Into Greek, right.
And, Jews in the Roman Empire outside of the land of Israel, many of them didn't know Hebrew. They didn't read the Torah in Hebrew. They read it in Greek. And if you read the Torah in Greek, it's a different world. It really is than the Torah in Hebrew. And I think that one can see why Jews preaching to Gentiles in the Greek-speaking world would be speaking literally in a different language, of course, but in some ways with different culture, different customs, different ways of looking at things. I mean, Greek thought is very different from Jewish. I mean, there's certain similarities between Greek and Jewish thought, and of course, the Talmud is influenced by Greek thought, and and possibly some of the Greek thinkers are influenced by Jewish thought. That's much debated. But fundamentally, there's so many big differences between the two.
Right. So what I want to do now is very Jewish. I want to bring you into the big arguments of Israeli society.
I'll do my best.
So no, a big one of the biggest debates, let's say, about this Bar-Kוכbא rebellion and everything. So in Israeli historiography, there is a famous and fierce debate regarding the Bar-Kוכbא revolt. So in the 80s, Yoshafat Harkabi famously sparked a massive controversy by viewing the revolt as a reckless, irrational catastrophe born of a messianic blindness. And on the other side of this polemic, figures like Dr. Israel Eldad and the renowned archaeologist Professor Yigal Yadin fiercely defended Bar-Kokhba, viewing the revolt as a heroic and justified stand for a national liberation. So based on your research, where do you stand in this debate if we're talking about Bar-Kokhba revolt?
Okay. So, I tend to be on the side of Yadin. I tend to think of Bar-Kokhba as a hero. But there's no question that the revolt led to disaster for the Jewish people. And one of the questions that Israeli scholars have raised, and by the way, of course, any of the work I've done is deeply in debt to previous scholars. I mean, I really stand on the shoulders of giants. But some of my Israeli colleagues have said the revolts were a terrible idea. If there had never been the revolts, the Jews would have lived in their land, they never would have been exiled, and they would have kept their religion, and everything would have been great. And my response to that is, I really don't believe that. No people in the ancient Near East got to keep their religion. Nobody. I think that if the Jews had stayed in Judea, I think they would have been as vibrant today as the Phoenicians are. I mean, nobody worships the Phoenician gods. Phoenician religion doesn't survive. So I'm highly dubious of this idea that if there hadn't been a revolt against the Romans, everything would have been great. And I don't believe that Bar-Kokhba is simply a fanatic and simply irrational. Of course, there are messianic aspects to the revolt. The very name Bar-Kokhba is suggesting he thinks he's the Messiah.
The Messiah, right.
Yeah, and Rabbi Akiva famously accepts him as the Messiah. And this is part of the picture. But there are many modern revolutions that have strong religious connotations to them. Look at the Iranian Revolution. That is an obvious one. But Marxism. Many people have said that Marxism is a secular faith, and I think it really is. Does that mean that the rebels had no rationality behind them? I don't think it does. Also, we have to remember that successful rebellions often survive improbably. It was utterly improbable that the Bolsheviks, who were a minority of a minority in Russia, utterly improbable that they would rule Russia. Utterly improbable that when the German High Command decides in 1917 to put Vladimir Lenin on a train in Zurich and to send him to Sweden, to cross the border into Russian Finland, to go to St. Petersburg, to start a revolution and pull Russia out of the war. Utterly improbable that it could have succeeded, but it did. So, I mean, I'm not a real fan of historical inevitability and say, you see, it never could have worked. I don't really think history works that way. Was Bar-Kokhba taking a chance? You bet he was taking a chance. Was there a good chance he would lose? Yes, but there was a good chance that Lenin would lose as well. There was a good chance that Mao would lose. Mao never would have won if the Americans had taken seriously the threat of the Russians, the Soviets, taking over China. There's a lot of historical contingencies that we have to take into account.
Yes, and I hear you speak, and I think to myself, maybe because you are not from you're not living in Israel, so you have a big virtue here in this debate because you can see things maybe more clearly, and not in a very political sense, because we know that this debate between Israel Eldad and Shofat Arkabi was very, very political, essentially.
Sure. And I understand that the debate has a lot to do with the character of Israel and whether Israel should be a secular country or a religious country. And that has many different manifestations in Israeli politics.
Yes, it was very, very hard to say it like that, because actually Yigal Yadin and Israel Eldad was not very religious in the Orthodox way. They were like more Zionist and, but yes, Messianic Zionist, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this has to do with the broader question of why the Jews survived. And the Jews would not have survived if not for the spiritual strength and the infrastructure of the rabbis and the rabbinical movement. Without that, Judaism doesn't survive. Judaism doesn't survive because of its armies. It survives for other reasons. Now, more recently, and particularly in response to the Holocaust, But not only in response to European anti-Semitism, Jews decided that the only way for them to be safe was to have a state. But that's a different story. There would be no Jews today if not for the spiritual resources. So I think that a simple dichotomy between rational secular thought good, religious thought fanatical bad, I don't think that's really useful.
Right. So in a way, I think that might be really the toughest question or toughest subject that I want to present to you. Maybe you've already said it right now, but it touches one of the deepest elements of Jewish faith throughout the generations, and what some historians and thinkers and philosophers, both Jewish and non-Jewish alike, have called one of the great mysteries of history. And it's really the secret of Jewish survival. So, the Roman Empire destroyed the temple, but eventually collapsed and vanished, while the Jewish people survived and thrived. Now, I must say, I have a nice yarmulke on my head, so I'm religious, I'm an Orthodox. But as a historian, can you try to explain this unique DNA that allowed the Jewish people to outlast Rome and even beyond it?
Well, I mean, that is the deepest
Quite a question.
You know that the French philosopher Pascal in the 17th century, when the king asked him, "How do we know? What's the proof that God exists?" And he famously says, "The Jews, sire, the Jews." I mean, we can't explain it. So in a sense, his answer was "hashgaka pratit." Otherwise, there's no way to understand what happened. How they survived. If we want a secular reason, I would have to credit the rabbis and the rabbinical movement, the Talmud, which kind of rebuilt Judaism from the ground up. And also perhaps a certain amount of good luck that the Jews were able, however difficult life was under the Roman Empire, and the Romans didn't utterly suppress the Jews, and the Jerusalem Talmud was written under Roman or Byzantine rule, but it was better in the Iranian Empire, in the Sasanian Empire, and also in the early Islamic period in Mesopotamia. Those academies were crucial for the survival.
Yeah, you're talking, of course, about the yeshivot, the big yeshivot of Sura and Pempadita, where the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, was actually integrated in. Yeah.
Yes, and the fact that the Jews have always had lands of refuge was tremendously important. Those lands of refuge, alas, usually end up turning on the Jews. But historically, the Jews have been very good at survival. They're certainly not the only people who have survived since antiquity. The Greeks survived, but first of all, they didn't have the religion they had in the earliest of ancient times. They gave it up for Christianity, for paganism. And secondly, they had their own homeland, which the Jews, by and large, did not. Of course, there were always Jewish settlements in the land of Israel, but they were very small after the Middle Ages, after the early Middle Ages. It's a super tough question, but I do think this the holy books and the infrastructure that the rabbis came up with allows the Jews to survive. It's an infrastructure that explains daily life, that gives people a framework that's deeply, deeply satisfying, but that also, to some extent, closes the community off from outside influence. Of course, it's never been completely successful. There always have been Jews who've broken off.
Right.
But I think it's a fantastic survival machine.
Yes. I think that Neil Ferguson, when I talked to him about that, he says something just like you have just elaborated. So, and that leads me to what I call myself the messianic paradox. So, messianism, or this way of thinking of the nation as the chosen people, this can be a very vital, inspiring force for nation survival and cohesion. But sometimes, it can be overrides rational geopolitical calculation, and maybe it can become catastrophic. How do you see this paradox playing out in ancient Judea and Rome and this period that you're talking about?
I mean, it's a great question. And, for instance, you might say that the rebels, if they had not had this messianic belief, or at least apocalyptic belief, they might have surrendered once. I mean, when the Romans surround Jerusalem and say surrender, and Josephus speaks to the rebels, from the Roman army saying, "You got to give up, guys. The game's over." And they stone him. The rebels are stoning him and knock him out. If they had been strictly rational, they might have given up. But then what would have happened? I mean, that's the question. If the Jews had given up and they just said, "You know what? We can survive with the Romans. It's okay." I mean, we know that the rabbis eventually do that. The rabbis come to the conclusion that you can't defeat these people. You just have to accept them. And the Talmud tells us that the rebellions were bad. They were a bad idea. And maybe there were, but what would have happened if there'd been no rebellions? Would there have been a rabbinic movement? Would there have been this, allow me to use the Yiddish, this pintel yid, the spark of Judaism that made people want to continue? I don't know, but I think that there's a line of Churchill that I cite in the book that goes with me, and that is that nations that tamely surrender are finished. Those that go down fighting will rise again. I was referring to Britain in 1940 in the darkest days, but I think there's some truth to that for the ancient Jews as well. Now, you might say, that's easy for you to say. Would you like to have been one of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were killed as a result of these rebellions? Would you like to have been the ones who paid tax to Rome for centuries as a result of this rebellion? And you might say that the rebellions had a lot to do with the stigmatizing of Jews, the unique stigmatizing of Jews in the Roman Empire, which is later on taken over by the Christians. There's no people who are stigmatized as much by the Romans as the Jews were. And that's because they see them as dyed-in-the-wool rebels, people who are going to rebel again and again and again. And that lays the groundwork for them to be the bad guys of Christianity. So you could say that's part of the price that the Jews paid for rebellion as well. So it's a very difficult calculus.
Yeah, so you just talked about the stigmatizing of the Jews, and I wanted to ask about the roots of anti-Semitism and your research. So some historians trace the origins of institutionalized Western anti-Semitism back to the Book of Esther, or perhaps to the Hellenistic Alexandria. In your book, I think you describe how following the rebellion, Rome imposed the, I'm trying to pronounce it, Fiscus Judaicus, which is
you pronounced
the
it.
Jewish
You're
tax.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
To benefit the god Jupiter, a humiliating tax levied on every single Jew in the empire, even those who hadn't revolted. So in your view, was this Roman policy maybe the true starting point of institutionalized Western anti-Semitism, framing the entire Jewish collective as an inherently hostile entity simply because of their distinctiveness?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's certainly a major stepping stone or a major major step on the path to anti-Semitism. Earlier on, there had been anti-Semitism in Alexandria. I mean, the Greek population of Alexandria accused the Jews of all sorts of horrible things. Josephus responds to this in one of his books Against Appian.
Against Appian, right.
Yes.
And there's a magnificent book by a historian, I think, named Peter Sperber, I think this is the name, about, it's called in Hebrew, Judophobia, about this period in Alexandria. Great book, yeah.
Yeah, there's a German scholar who's written about.
I think it's him. I think it's him. Yeah.
Gosh, I'm blanking on his name. He's a superb scholar, really excellent. Yes. So, I mean, Alexandria. If you want to trace the roots of anti-Semitism to one place, I think it would be Alexandria. But the Romans take this ball and run with it, and it's a complicated story, but. I think the Romans give a theological cast the Fiscus Judaicus, as you said, it's not just paid to the Roman treasury, it's paid to Jupiter. It's paid to the chief god of Rome. And it's as if the Romans are saying to the Jews, our God is bigger than your God. Um, During the Jewish revolt, during the Great Revolt, the temple of Jupiter in Rome burns down as a revolt, as a result of the civil war in Rome. And I think that it's been suggested, I don't know if it's true, that one of the reasons the Romans want to destroy the temple is they say, if our temple burns down, your temple burns down. And we always talk about Jewish messianism and Jewish fanaticism, but there's something fanatical about the Romans levying this tax on the Jews and saying every Jew in the Roman Empire must pay this to Jupiter to show who's on top, that our God is bigger than your God. And it lasts for 300 years. It's not a flash in the pan. It goes on for a long time. And it's really grotesque. I mean, they are examining Jewish men for circumcision. I mean, that's kind of grotesque when you think about it.
Right.
So
fanaticism is not just a Jewish invention. Yeah.
It's not just Jewish invention. It's on both sides. There's fanaticism. People in the ancient world were deeply religious. You know,
Right.
Paganism is a little hard for us to understand, but they were deeply religious in their own way. It's a much more shallow, we might say it's a much more shallow belief than Judaism or any of the monotheistic religions. But maybe that's unfair. It's unfair. They're still pagans today, polytheists today in India, and maybe they're every bit as profound as we are. I don't know.
Right.
But certainly the Romans were serious about this.
Yes. So let's play a game of what if. Now,
Okay.
one of the most fascinating sections in your book deals with King Herod. I think in the
Yes.
Hebrew version, it's page 111. It was really, really great. So one of the most, and you present him as in a complex light, you know, a
Right.
brutal tyrant on one hand, but a deeply pragmatic statesman on the other who managed to balance Rome's imperial interests
Right.
with Jewish sensibilities and built one of the most magnificent temples in the East.
Yes.
So if Herod's successors had shared his realistic, pragmatic approach to geopolitics, could the catastrophic war with Rome have been avoided altogether? Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, my portrait of Herod owes a great deal to an Israeli scholar whose name escapes me at the moment. I think it was Shalit, but I may be wrong. He wrote a great book about Herod in Hebrew, but translated into German, so I could read it. And it's pretty much the picture that he gives. Yes, it's both a combination of Herod and Augustus. Let us not forget that the Roman Empire under Herod makes that the priests in Jerusalem make daily sacrifices to on behalf of the Roman emperor in the temple in Jerusalem. They're sacrifices to God, not to the Roman emperor, but on behalf of the Roman Empire. And who pays for these sacrifices? The Roman Emperor Augustus pays for them, and his successors pay for them. That's how successful Herod was in building a partnership with the Romans. Josephus says that Herod is second only to Agrippa in Augustus's favor. I'm not sure that's true, but he was very high in Augustus's favor, and he's a master politician. He's a very brutal man, you know, who's responsible for a lot of innocent deaths, and he's a tyrant. But he's also extremely clever, and he builds up Judea both as both Jewish landmarks, most famously the temple, but also pagan landmarks. He built Caesarea, which is one of the wonders of the world. It's an artificial port. It's very impressive, and it has a temple of Augustus. And he builds a new city in Samaria.
Sebastian, I think.
Excuse me?
Sebastian. Yeah.
Sebastian, which means it means Augusta. It's Greek for Augusta.
Oh, really? I didn't know
Yes, it's the Greek for Augusta, and there's a temple of Augustus there. And finally, there's this spectacular temple of Augustus on the road to Damascus at the foot of Mount Hermon, which I was able to visit in northern Israel. It's a wonderful, wonderful site. So he's pretty serious about saying to the Romans, "We're your friends," you know. And I think that Orthodox Jewish opinion is outraged by this. You shouldn't be building pagan temples in the Holy Land, Eretz HaKodesh. You shouldn't be doing this. So Herod is also Herod, believe it or not, is the great patron of the Olympic Games in Greece, and he actually goes to the Olympic Games in Greece, which are religious. They're a religious festival as well as an athletic festival. And finally, Herod is one of the great builders of this new city that Augustus builds in western Greece called Nicopolis, Victory City, to commemorate his victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. So Herod's all over the place, you know. And yes, he's a pragmatist. If when he dies, his kingdom is divided among three of his sons. Unfortunately, Herod has killed off his most talented and competent sons because he saw them as rivals for his throne, probably correctly, probably were rivals to his throne. And so only the incompetents are left. And eventually the one ruling Jerusalem and most of Judea gets fired by Augustus and sent into exile in Gaul. So that's how Judea becomes a Roman province. If it had been differently, if he'd had a clever successor, and if the Roman emperors had continued to be as clever and pragmatic as Augustus, then things could have been differently. But things could have gone differently. There might never have been a revolt. But that would require statesmanship on the part of both sides. And statesmanship is one of the rarest qualities in history. Most rulers are not statesmen. That's the sad truth. So the fact that it all went south, not surprising.
So let's talk now about the maybe the dark side of the Jewish rebellion and the sad side, maybe the collective unconscious trauma, I would say, that till today, you say, you know, to Jews, especially in Israel, when things are going to get heated, you know, politically speaking, everything, and we remember the days of the Second Temple, you know, it's there. It's just there. So you emphasize that the besieged Jews in Jerusalem wasted their energy, killing one another and burning their own food supplies long before Rome ever breached the walls. How much of this is actually a historical myth? How much it's reality, you think? Your thoughts?
Oh, I don't think it's a myth. I mean, I think that Josephus is telling it like it is. I don't know if enough of Tacitus survives that he talks about this as well. And the Talmud, of course, talks about it quite a bit and says that Sinat Hinam is what destroyed the rebels. So senseless or causeless hatred is what destroyed the rebels. I don't think it's a myth. I think that the rebels did themselves in. And again, you know, you want to ask, what if? Well, what if they hadn't done this? What if they had...
My next question was actually this, Yeah,
what if they buried their quarrels and they presented a united front to the Romans? Well, here's another way in which we can imagine the revolt succeeding. What if Titus was unsuccessful at taking Jerusalem? What if the rebels had held out a lot longer? I mean, they last, I forget, it's 4 or 5 months. I forget whether it's 4 or 5 months. That's not nothing, but there are cities that last under siege for a lot longer time than that. And the rebels could have lasted for a lot longer time than that if they hadn't starved themselves. The Romans had trouble getting water. The rebels had a natural spring within the walls of Jerusalem. They had all the water they needed. The Romans didn't have water. They had to go and fetch water from far away. They didn't have food, didn't have trees, they didn't have wood either. They burnt all the wood around Jerusalem, and at a certain point, they had to be schlepping this wood from fairly far. So it was not an easy siege for the Romans. And we could imagine the rebels holding out longer, and eventually the Romans saying, okay, let's make a deal. It's not inconceivable. The Romans weren't supermen.
Right. So we've been talking about Sinat Chinam, and when you watched the deep polarization in Israel in the months leading up to October 7th, did you feel, a terrifying sense of history repeating itself?
Absolutely. So I was actually living in Israel in the spring of 2023.
Wow.
Yeah, doing research for this book. I might have, if the original plan had taken place and they'd attacked on Pesach, I would have been there when it happened. Of course, it's October 7th later, a few months later. But of course, I thought about this, and some of my colleagues, Jewish historians who I was in touch with while I was there, they all talked about this. We all did, that this is just frighteningly familiar. And I know there were Israeli journalists also in the press who taught columns that were written at the time saying this is terrifying reminder of what went on during the Jewish revolt. So yes, I did think about that. And it's not ridiculous to think that this is one of the things that encouraged Hamas to attack and encouraged their Iranian overlords to give them the green light. The fact that they saw the Israelis divided and they thought this is a good time to strike.
So just to sum up this section of our conversation, like what is the most critical lessons that Israelis in 2026 should take away from the failure of the revolt, of the rebellion against the Romans?
Well, I think a critical lesson for Israelis, and not just for Israelis, but true for Americans and true for everyone, is disunity kills. And, in a democracy, we want to have debates. We need to have debates, but there's a certain point where you have to close ranks and say, for the duration, we are not going to do business as usual, but we're all going to be marching to the same tune. In Britain in World War I, they had something called the Defense of the Realm Act, which was a way of saying, in effect, we will suspend normal civil liberties until the crisis is over. And of course, in the United States during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, without benefit of law, just suspended habeas corpus, saying, you've got to do that. There's a bigger issue going on here. For the good of the country, we need to do that. I think, and he did allow the election to go on in 1864, which is a great tribute to him and to American democracy. But I think that in times of war, there's only so much dispute that you can tolerate. Of course, what happened in Jerusalem was not just dispute, it was civil war.
Civil war ongoing, yeah.
They're killing each other. They're starving each other. And I think one lesson for Israelis, and again, not just for Israelis, is there's only so much disunity a nation can afford in time of war. I think there's a tendency on the part of some countries, and I'd say the United States is totally guilty of this, of thinking, we're the only people who matter. And so we have the luxury of thinking whatever we want and fighting with each other and saying whatever we want to the world. It doesn't make any difference because we're untouchable. This is a very dangerous opinion to have. And you have to strike a balance between the democratic debate you want and need and the ability to close ranks. I would say there are many, many great things about Israelis, but closing ranks is not one of the things that they're most famous for. Although they have, when the crisis comes, they have closed ranks and they do close ranks. It doesn't last very long, though.
No, not very long. I can remember the face of the second interview in the podcast Trigonometry with Konstantin Kissin. So the other guy, I can't remember his name.
Francis Foster.
Francis Foster. When you just explain to him what has actually happened when all the Jews actually fighting within themselves when the Romans were outside the gates of Jerusalem, and he was shocked. He was what? They would deserve to lose.
Well, it is shocking, and maybe Josephus has slightly exaggerated it because he's really opposed to the rebels. But there's enough of it that's true that it's just, pretty bad. And there's a real lesson to take away from that.
Yeah. So let's hope we're gonna do it. I'm trying with my podcast, but so let's move and talk about the current state of the West, let's say, and the parallels to Rome. And I think a question that's gonna bring us there, you emphasize that archaeology and history prove beyond a doubt that Jews are the indigenous people of the land of Israel, not settler colonialists, as widely claimed today. Just to me personally, this is a very basic historical fact that wouldn't even need repeating if it weren't for the current political discourse.
Yes.
But in today's hostile academic and Western discourse, how much weight you think does this historical archaeological truth actually carry, or are facts losing the war against the narrative?
Well, I think, in the current world in which we live, in the digital age and the age of social media, it's very hard for facts to win. I mean, we see this in the United States, for instance, in the what's absolutely a dogma for many is that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. And you just have to look at the historical definition of genocide, and it hasn't committed genocide. You might say its tactics were too harsh in Gaza, that it should have taken made more of an effort to spare civilians. Of course, the IDF did do a lot to spare civilians, but no doubt they made mistakes. No doubt they could have done some things better. One person I read made a very convincing comparison to what the Americans and the Brits did to France on the run-up to D-Day. The Germans had put a lot of their soldiers in civilian areas. And so, and also the trains were essential for German logistics. So the Allies attacked these trains. They attacked civilian areas. They killed a lot of innocent French civilians. It was terrible. But I think they would have said, the necessities of war justified it, and the larger goal of freeing France from the Nazis justified it. Hamas, of course, chose to put its military in the heart of civilian life in Gaza. And so there was no way to defeat them without, unfortunately, exposing civilians to death, to destruction or death, injury or death, excuse me. But that's not genocide. It's really something different. Anyhow, I'm digressing. I think it's really hard for facts to survive. Also, I mean, it started even before social media, just in the age of television. People love debates. They love passion. They love fire. And that's not the way to really discover the truth. If you want to discover the truth, you have to be dispassionate, and you have to be willing to look at both sides of the story. So that's a hard thing to do in our current environment. And as you know, particularly in the United States, the universities are very politicized as well.
Right.
And, they're not. Maybe they never were purely ivory towers. Surely they never were purely ivory towers. But the search for truth has become much more politicized than it used to be.
Okay, so with this optimistic note, you argued in several podcasts that I've heard. One of them was your first podcast with Konstantin Kissin and his friend
Francis Foster.
Francis Foster, yes, great. I like them very much. So you argue that the patterns of Roman decline can be seen everywhere, actually, in the contemporary Western culture. Where do you see it? What is the root of everything, if I could say?
I think that, I'm going to go back to a paradigm that comes from the ancient Greeks and Romans, and then was restated, I think, very eloquently by the Arab historian Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century. And that is that civilizations go through cycles. Ibn Khaldun said that what often happens is that you have savage people living in the desert, and the only way they can survive is to have an extraordinary strong sense of group cohesion. I believe the Arabic term is asabia. And what happens to people, as a result of this cohesion, these tribes become very formidable militarily, and they can conquer cities that are wealthy and luxurious and sophisticated, and that have let their defenses go down, and that no longer believe in themselves. They've lost all their sense of cohesion, the sense of tribal group identity. And so they're conquered by the outsiders. And then the outsiders come in and they take over the city, and now they have all this wealth. And in turn, they get corrupted. And their sons and grandsons, their children and grandchildren all get corrupted, and they get soft. The ancient Greeks would have said luxury kills. The Romans would have said it as well. Luxury kills. And I think to some extent that's what's happened in the West. It's certainly happened in the United States. The United States has become a very soft society, extremely wealthy, extremely luxurious. There are poor people in the US, unfortunately, but on the whole, Americans enjoy a standard of living that's unheard of in human history. I mean, it's just really remarkable what goes on in the United States and how wealthy we are and how fortunate we are. But I think the downside of this is that people lose sight of the basics and the fundamentals. I mean, one of the ways in which we see it is the lack of interest in having children, the lack of interest in propagating. And I don't want to cast any stones. You know, if people decide not to have children, it's a free country. They can do that if they like. But it becomes a little bit concerning when a whole generation says, not so interested in reproducing.
Right.
It doesn't suggest that the society has confidence in itself and that it believes in itself. We also see it in the decline of religion, which is, a big part of the Western cultural scene today, especially in Europe, but to some extent in the United States as well. And Israel, of course, is very different in those ways. It's a much more religious society, a much more familial society, a much more traditional society. One of the things that always struck me about Israel as a relatively secular Western Jew, a diaspora Jew visiting Israel, is the degree to which even very secular Israelis have Shabbat dinner. Whoa.
Right.
I mean, this was very different than Jewish life growing up when I did in the United States. And it's a sign of a degree of social solidarity that is not to be taken for granted in other countries, at least other Western countries.
Yes, you know what was fascinating to me? I talked with Professor Paul Ray, which maybe you know of.
I know him well, yes.
Yes, from Hillsdale College. So he had a very big interview here in Israel. And he just told me the same thing, that he pointed out to me that during the late imperial era, the wealthy populations of Italy were actually entirely unarmed, much like modern Europeans today.
Yes.
And Rome fell partly because it stopped relying on its citizens for defense and outsourced its military to foreign mercenaries. And he told me, listen, just look at the Western Europeans today and parts of maybe the more liberal sides of American society. You just need to see and understand how Rome fell. And when I heard you say it again from your perspective, and here are two big scholars and professors of history and military history, wow, it's a profound insight.
Well, we may both be wrong. I don't know, but I think that there are.
I hope for the West, because it's a very serious idea. Because how can you actually bring a whole society? What are you gonna actually do with all the wealth? The Western Europe and America is a very wealth population. You cannot reverse it. You don't want to reverse it. No. What you can do?
Well, I mean, there are things you can do, and I think that there are reasons to be optimistic. I mean, or we're not, the late Roman Empire yet. I mean, one of the things about the late Roman Empire is that it pretty much gave up its political system. The Senate was meaningless. There was no way to rally elite opinion, the rallying movers and shakers behind the crisis that the Romans faced when they had very serious enemies in both East and West. And the later Roman Empire was a very wealthy country. It really was. And it spent a lot of money on the military. It turned out to be having spent it on the wrong things. And it needed to reverse course. It needed to innovate. And it just didn't have the cultural and political resources to do that. But in the United States, at any rate, we're not that far gone yet. I mean, we still have a lot of political resources. We still have a Republican Democratic political system. And one of the really hopeful things I think that's happened in recent years has been a number of movements that are going on in American education that are very helpful. One, and some of my colleagues at Hoover are involved in, is civic education. And this is springing up all over the United States. A return to what used to be poo-pooed, scoffed at as an old-fashioned thing, civics, teaching citizenship. It's become a big thing.
Yeah, and you talk about the concept of citizenship is a very, very fundamental key, very important key. One of the great triumphs of the West generally that the West needs to come back to, right? Can you just elaborate for Israeli? What is the concept of citizenship? Why it's so important?
I think Israelis just take it for granted because Israel is a society with a very strong concept of citizenship for a number of reasons, not least among them is military service. The fact that Israelis are expected, or at least Jewish Israelis are expected to serve in the military, to serve their country. Classically, in Greece and Rome, this was the fundamental thing for citizenship for males, and that females were expected to be supportive of their menfolk in going to war. I mean, there are many things that women had to do to be successful. But besides that, the fact that Israel is such a political society and people take politics so seriously. I mean, I remember visiting Israel in the 1980s and being on the bus, and they would put the news on the bus. I mean, that was not something that happened in any country that I was familiar with. People just took things much more seriously. I think that the notion of citizenship, it's not going to be the same as it was in ancient Greece and Rome. Citizenship is not going to be as active as it was for most people in those societies. We have representative systems of government, and that allows us to have more time to spend, frankly, on business and private affairs. But nonetheless, I think we have to be more knowledgeable of public affairs. I think we have to be more educated about what a constitutional republic is. And we also have to be aware of the fact that you can lose a constitutional republic. I mean, as Benjamin Franklin famously was asked during the Constitutional Convention, he came outside and someone said, "Well, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government are we going to have?" And Franklin answered, "A republic if you can keep it." And I think that's absolutely true. Republics are very fragile, and they only work if people believe in them in their hearts, and if people are willing to support them and fight for them, if they're willing to vote, if they're willing to hold their representatives to account. It doesn't work if everyone's passive and enjoying the good life all the time and leaving it to someone else to run it. That is a recipe for disaster in terms of keeping a republic. The Romans went down that route. The Romans went down that route. We haven't gone down it yet. It's a danger, but I've seen some hopeful signs. Another one is the growth of classical academies. These are private schools. There are now, I think, well over 1,000 of them in the U.S. that are educating people with a lot of classical education, having them read about Greece and Rome and ancient classical ideas of citizenship. I think this is a tremendously good sign, more important than ever in the age of AI, in which the danger of passivity has grown exponentially, and in which in many American universities, the kind of subjects that used to teach about citizenship are not so interested in it anymore. There have been some good signs of pushback and of regeneration. And I think one of the things that's great about the United States is its ability to regenerate, its ability to regrow. I think that immigration has a lot to do with it. And the fact that there have been so many immigrants to the U.S. since 1965, it's a second or third great age of immigration. There have been some tensions, and I think we've made some mistakes. I don't think that we've paid enough attention to assimilating immigrants. But nonetheless, on the whole, it's a fabulous success story, and immigrants are contributing in remarkable ways to the U.S.
When we need to talk about the concept of citizenship, maybe the core of concept of citizenship is education. People need to care about their country. And what was very fascinating for me, I've heard your podcast with trigonometry, where I was in Scotland. So I recently visited there. I went to Glasgow to the Isle of Skye in Scotland to talk with a very famous philosopher, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, which is really great. But when I was in Glasgow, I visited a very big museum, just right next to the university. It's the biggest museum in Glasgow. And it was very heartbreaking to see that the entire exhibit on Scottish history was framed solely around slavery, exploitation, guilt, completely omitting that Britain was among the first to outlaw slavery and used its global power to enforce
Right.
abolition
Right.
worldwide.
Yes.
As a non-Brit who admires parts of Western civilization, as a Jew, it saddened me. I was very sad just to walk there and see it.
I know it is very sad. And I think it's an example of what Ibn Khaldun wrote about, the lack of a sense of strong social cohesion and tribal identity and belief in oneself. And we've seen it before. We saw it in classical Athens when the elite youths of Athens became convinced that they lived in a sick society, and that the democracy needed to be overturned, and they needed to impose a Spartan sort of system in Athens. They thought it was very chic and fashionable to despise their own society and talk about its failures. And I think and that was when Athens was at its wealthiest and most powerful. And I think this is a disease of wealthy and powerful countries, wealthy and powerful societies. They turn in on themselves. I don't entirely understand the psychological mechanism by which it happens, but we see it again and again in history. The Romans did it too. Roman writers loved the idea of the noble savage, and they wrote how wonderful the Germans were, not really because they cared much about the Germans, but they used it as a stick to beat the Romans with.
Right.
So
Tacitus, I think, did it, right?
Yes, he does in his
Yeah.
Germania. So it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for society to lose all belief in itself and to constantly be beating its breast about its crimes and its failures. And I think if people thought they were really at risk of their lives, that they would stop, that they would turn around and defend the society. But I think fundamentally people in the West feel invulnerable, and they don't really see dangers on the horizons. And so they feel they can indulge in this luxury, this luxury passion of saying, "Woe is me! We are so evil. We are the worst people in history." Da, 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 da.
Right. Let's pray for sanity and goodness again that would rise in the West. So just to conclude, you
Yeah.
have mentioned that one of your upcoming book projects might explore ancient leadership during times of crisis, I think.
Yeah.
If you could resurrect just one leader from antiquity to guide the Western world today, or Israel, let's say, through our current crisis, who would it be and why?
That is a very good question. So, a leader from Greece or Rome? Well, it's hard to think of a more successful leader than Augustus, because he was extremely intelligent. He was a brilliant man. He wasn't a peaceful man all the while, but he had a vision what he wanted to achieve, and he was a pragmatist about achieving it. And he was willing, once he defeated his enemies and came to power, he realized that what you needed to do was make peace, and you needed to win friends, and you needed to bring them over to your side, and you needed to build coalitions. So I think there's a lot to be learned from him. To be sure, he was a megalomaniac, and he made himself and his family talk about a cult of personality. He certainly did that as well. But there's something to be learned from the fact that he had a vision and that he was quite pragmatic about carrying it out, and that he understood that the way to make peace is to shake hands with your enemies. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
Okay, Professor Barry Strauss, thank you very much. I
You're
really
very
can
welcome.
recommend this very, very good book with a great translation to Hebrew.
Thank
And
you.
hopefully seeing you in Israel.
I hope. Yeah, I had hoped to come last month, but things didn't work out. But I hope that I'll have a chance to come again in the not too distant future. I love Israel, and I'm always thrilled to be there, energized by my time there. So
Thank you very much for your time now.
Thank you, Matan. My pleasure.